Are you struggling to get your film scenes to look realistic while feeling the squeeze from a limited budget? In today's episode, I give you the secrets to achieving a frame that looks like this at any budget level. Don't skip around. I've sprinkled my no budget tips throughout the video. The easiest way to make it look like a grocery store is to leave it lit like a grocery store. This piece of advice can mean a lot of things, but for this video, it means to use the existing lighting whenever possible to begin shaping a scene. And there's two ways that I use this advice for my frames. First, since ambient sunlight is always cheaper than using additional lighting, I use the sun to help light my shots whenever possible. To make using the sun easier, I use an app like Photo Pills that shows me when and where in the sky the sun will be at the location I'll be filming. That way, I know to be on side A of the building to get indirect lighting in the morning scenes, and on side B for the afternoon scenes. I can be sure I'll be getting a nice soft fill through the windows without fighting ever-changing direct sunlight. If I'm filming an outdoor scene, the app helps me place the sun behind my actors so that they're lit with a far side key. This results in a more cinematic look than if the scene were lit frontally. I'll drop a link below to a video explaining how to use a far side key for more cinematic looking shots. An advantage of shooting outdoors is that it can be relatively inexpensive to do. Depending on how wide the frame is, I usually just use bounce to fill in the faces of my talent when I'm backlighting them with the sun. A DIY way to do this is to buy a large piece of foam board from Home Depot to make what's called a bead board. You can also accomplish the same thing using the white side of a 5-in-1 reflector. The advantage of the bead board is a very nice soft quality of light, while the reflector definitely wins in the portability department. The white side will only bounce the sun so far though, so if the frame is too wide for the white side to be effective, then I'll back way up and use the silver shiny side. And I can rig these with specialized clips if I don't want to try to Hollywood them or hold them steady throughout the take. The second way that I leave it lit like a grocery store is that I use the existing lighting and then supplement with my own. Here's a scene from a 48-hour film fest that I recently lit, and this took place, you guessed it, in a grocery store. We had less than 90 minutes to get the frames that we wanted from inside this location, and we needed to do it while they were open. So I brought in just 2 tubes to use as a key and rim light rather than waste the team's time and try to light the whole grocery store. With those tubes and a few extra pieces of kit called floppies that I used to block some of the harsh overhead lighting on our talent, I was able to have an efficient setup that allowed us to get all of the scenes that we needed. Using lights from the location is a great way to keep the scene looking like it takes place where it's being filmed. You can see actual grocery store lights in the background of these shots, and for this scene, that means using this lamp and some afternoon sunlight to bring up the room level. In order to keep the lamp from being too bright, I've added a dimmer so that I can control the output. On location though, controlling these lights can be a bit more of a troubleshoot. Let me know down below if you want me to make that episode. This lamp is also what's known as a practical light. Practical lights are any lights that are viewable in frame, and they add realism to a scene in 2 ways. They establish a relative bright point in frame for the eye to balance everything else to, and they give motivation for other lights to be used to help fill in the scene. By giving the eye something bright to look at, our brains go, okay, that's how bright this neon sign is. The talent's skin tone is duller than that, and that makes total sense, because how could they be brighter than a neon sign? Put another way, having a brightest and darkest point in the frame anchors the intensity of everything else in frame. A trick to making sure that I'm not blowing out the highlights or crushing the blacks and losing color data is to use the false color on an external monitor to check exposure levels. If you don't have an external monitor, check to see if your camera has an exposure limit setting so you at least know if you've gone too bright. The second way that practicals add to the realism of a frame is they provide motivation for off-camera lighting to be used. This lamp isn't what's outputting the tungsten light that you see on the wall. That's actually this panel light that's sitting just out of frame. But the combination of the two creates a realistic looking lighting. An inexpensive way to have a lamp in frame while having control over the output of the light is to use incandescent bulbs and a dimmer switch. If you've got more money to burn, or you would like additional color options, you can buy yourself some film quality practicals to use instead. These lights come in a few different shapes and sizes, from tubes to mini LEDs to bulbs. All of these lights can output light in any color in RGB mode and can also be tuned across a wide range of color temperatures in CCT mode. Oh hey, what a coincidence! That brings us to the third point. Using multiple color temperatures can add realism to a scene in both obvious and subtle ways. If you think you need a refresher on what color temperature is, I've linked a video video below so that you can get caught up to speed. Sometimes, a realistic looking frame calls for a wide difference in color temperatures. By using a cool color temperature for the moonlight and a very warm tungsten one for the key light, I'm creating a complementary color look that looks cinematic and feels realistic. I can also use smaller differences in color temperatures to get more subtle effects. Direct sunlight is measured at about 5600 Kelvin, but overhead blue sky is closer to 8000 Kelvin. By using two lights to create this shot, a daylight balanced key light and a colder room fill light, I get a look that feels more like it's lit by mid-afternoon sun than if both lights were at the same color temperature. Some lighting units, called bicolor or full spectrum units, allow you to tune these values in at the twist of a dial for a more efficient workflow. If your lights output at only one color, you can use color diffusion gels that will either add warmth or cool them off. Click the video that I've linked below to learn how to use gels as part of a more comprehensive approach to using color theory in your films. I'm using 5 lights to mix color temperature in this frame, not including the ambient sunlight. The first 2 lights are the tungsten colored practical bulb and panel light combination that I talked about earlier. These are adding the warm orange glow to the left edge of the frame. The third light is this 2-foot infinibar. I've set the color temperature on this one to match the previous 2, and it's adding definition to my cheek on the shadow side of my face and my shoulder. The next is my key light, where I've used both quarter CTO and quarter CTB gels inside this modifier. This adds some movement to the color temperature on my skin tone as I bounce across the frame. Lastly, I've got a point source with a Fresnel attachment adding hard shadows to the background of the frame. I've placed a half CTO gel in front of this so that it feels more like afternoon sunlight. If you're enjoying this video, please consider subscribing. It gives me feedback on how this video is being received, and it allows more viewers like yourself to learn these tips. The hard shadows in the back of my frame bring me to my fourth point, and that is to turn up the realism by having both hard and soft lighting in the same frame. One example of how this lighting gets used over and over in Hollywood is sunlight streaming through a window onto the talent. There's multiple ways to light this depending on the tools on hand. To have the most control over the exposure levels throughout the scene, I'll achieve this with 2 sources of light, one hard and one soft. Placing barn doors on the hard source and a grid on the soft one gives me control over the spill of each light so that I can aim them more easily. A more cost-effective way to do this is to use a hard source and a silk frame to diffuse the light to add softness. An even more cost-effective way to achieve this effect is to use a white sheet instead of a silk diffusion screen. Mixing hard and soft light in other parts of the frame also helps to achieve a more realistic look. The sunbeams this light casts behind me also give reason for which side I place my key light on. To the viewer, it'll feel more natural for me to place the key light on the side where the sun is. If you're just starting out on your film journey and looking to use these tips, be sure to click the video that you see here so you can be confident the first light you purchase will be one that grows with you. Thanks for tuning in, and I'll see you next week.